In the rotting theater of ancient history, some tales smell like incense and glory, while others reek of burnt flesh and oil. Few drip with both nobility and horror as much as the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general whose life was a hymn to discipline and whose death was a carnival of cruelty. His end, boiled alive like some sacrificial goat in a cauldron of oil, is the sort of nightmare that even Rome's blood-soaked annals couldn't bleach out. Here was a man who embodied Rome's virtues of courage, duty, and ironclad honor. And it was precisely those virtues that marched him, shackled and unblinking, into the arms of the most barbaric fate the Punic Wars could vomit up. Born into the Roman aristocracy around 307 BC, Regulus was the Republic's perfect specimen, strict, disciplined, fearless, and entirely incapable of compromise. Rome at the time was a hungry beast in armor, swelling with conquest, eager to plant its standards across the Mediterranean. Its appetite was Sicily, but its rival was Carthage, that rich, sea-slicked empire whose very existence stood between Rome and domination. The clash was inevitable. When Rome and Carthage collided in the First Punic War, it was not simply two powers contesting Sicily, it was two civilizations clawing at one another with such savagery that even the gods, it seemed, looked away. The war began in 264 BC. Rome, a land power with all the naval experience of a farmer on a fishing trip, had to build a fleet from scratch just to challenge Carthage's mastery at sea. The struggle dragged on for decades, a bleeding contest of sieges, sea battles, and stubbornness. And into this meat grinder stepped Regulus, who would prove himself first as consul in 267 BC. He crushed the Salentini in southern Italy, his reputation for tactical brilliance spreading like wildfire. By the time the Punic Wars erupted in earnest, his name already carried weight. Soldiers trusted him. The Senate respected him. Enemies would soon curse him. The bold turning point came in 256 BC, when Regulus, serving as consul again, was handed command of Rome's invasion of Africa itself. This was not just a campaign, it was audacity dipped in arrogance. Instead of slogging endlessly in Sicily, why not stab Carthage in the gut by taking the fight straight to their own soil? Regulus boarded one of Rome's greatest fleets ever assembled. 330 ships carrying 140,000 men. The sight of such a juggernaut crossing the Mediterranean must have made Carthaginian mothers choke on their prayers. The landing at Clup was nothing short of devastating. Roman soldiers poured ashore, tearing across African fields, their armor flashing in the sun, their horns blaring doom. Carthaginian defenders stumbled back in panic, unprepared for Roman boldness this mad. Regulus didn't just fight battles, he performed psychological warfare. Cities collapsed, treasure caravans flowed into Roman camps, and the legionnaires, tired of Sicilian mud, suddenly found themselves knee-deep in African gold, ivory, and slaves. For the first time in history, Carthaginian mothers heard Roman war horns echoing across their own fields. The terror was biblical. Panic gripped Carthage. Its ruling council, sweating over the prospect of siege and annihilation, sent envoys crawling to Regulus, begging for terms. And here, at the height of his triumph, Regulus revealed the flaw that would be carved on his tombstone. His terms: brutal, uncompromising, humiliating. He demanded the surrender of Sicily and Sardinia, crushing war reparations, and the reduction of Carthage to a toothless puppet of Rome. Even worse, he demanded they gut their navy until it was reduced to a handful of toy boats, stripping away the very lifeblood of their maritime empire. To Carthage, these terms were worse than defeat. They were castration. To Regulus, this was simply Rome's divine right. He couldn't bend. He wouldn't bend. War for Rome was not about negotiation. It was about virtue and destiny, about the gods themselves blessing the victorious. To the Carthaginians, war was business, costly, bloody business, but business nonetheless. To Regulus, it was holy, and in that holy stubbornness, he signed his own doom. What Regulus didn't see, what his pride blinded him to, was that his moment of greatest glory was also his most fragile. His army was deep in enemy territory, supply lines stretched thin. Carthage, humiliated but not broken, began to rally. Salvation arrived in the form of a mercenary, Xanthippus, a Spartan strategist whose cold tactical genius would soon shred Regulus's overconfidence like meat in the jaws of war elephants. Regulus, high on victory and drunk on his own sense of divine mission, mistook fortune's smile for eternal favor. Carthage, meanwhile, had stopped weeping and started sharpening its knives. Salvation arrived in the unlikely form of Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary with the soul of a tactician and the eyes of a butcher. He looked at Carthage's mess, sneered, and told them bluntly, "You're losing because you're idiots. You have cavalry, you have elephants, use them." And suddenly, Carthage had something Rome did not: a general who knew exactly how to turn Roman discipline into Roman downfall. Xanthippus whipped Carthage's broken forces into something sharp and terrifying. War elephants, those living battering rams, were trained to smash through shield walls like pottery. Numidian cavalry, horsemen born in the saddle, quick and ruthless, were drilled to strike and scatter with precision. The soldiers, beaten down by losses, rediscovered discipline under his harsh eye. In short, Carthage became dangerous again, and Regulus, blind with confidence, didn't even notice the shift. His men lounged fat with plunder, their discipline softening. He ignored intelligence reports of Carthage's growing strength, dismissing it as desperation. Pride is the most efficient poison, and Regulus drank it daily. Then came the Battle of Tunis in 255 BC, a disaster so absolute it felt like the gods had decided to make an example of Rome. The open plains around Tunis were perfect for cavalry and elephants. In other words, perfect for Carthage. Xanthippus chose his battlefield like an executioner choosing the right blade. Regulus, too arrogant to retreat or reconsider, marched straight into the slaughterhouse. The battle opened with Carthaginian cavalry sweeping the Roman flanks. The Romans, so used to grinding it out with infantry, found themselves shredded before they could even form their beloved formations. Then came the elephants, storming through the Roman lines like moving fortresses, tusks slashing, trunks smashing, bodies trampling. The legions, disciplined but brittle in the wrong terrain, broke apart. What had once been the unstoppable machine of Rome collapsed into chaos. And there, in the middle of this nightmare, was Regulus himself. Whatever else you can say about him, he did not run. The man fought like a cornered wolf, sword dripping with blood, trying to rally the fragments of his army even as the ground itself trembled with the thunder of elephants. Ancient sources describe him slashing, shouting, refusing to flee, until sheer exhaustion, wounds, and the tide of Carthaginian numbers dragged him down. Captured, shackled, broken. The aftermath was apocalyptic for Rome. Of the colossal invasion force that had landed in Africa, with swagger and fanfare, only a pitiful handful staggered back to Sicily. Tens of thousands slaughtered, tens of thousands more in chains. It was one of Rome's greatest humiliations, and the soldiers who survived would never forget the sight of their general hauled off in captivity. For them, his chains were heavier than their own. And yet, what awaited Regulus was worse than battlefield defeat. His capture transformed him from a warrior into a political bargaining chip. Carthage had in its hands not just any prisoner, but a Roman consul, a general whose name carried weight in the Senate, a man who embodied Roman discipline. They treated him at first with deceptive courtesy. He was not tossed into a dungeon, but housed in comfort, an honored prisoner, kept alive for his usefulness. For years, Regulus endured this gilded captivity. His presence was a living reminder to Rome of Carthage's strength and to Carthage of Rome's vulnerability. He became a symbol, a Roman lion in a foreign cage, too valuable to kill, too dangerous to ignore. Stories of his unbroken spirit trickled back to Rome, where he was remembered as a man who, even in chains, represented Roman virtue. To Carthage, he was leverage. To Rome, he was legend in waiting. But all gilded cages eventually rot. As the war dragged on, both Rome and Carthage grew weary of blood and cost. Exhaustion bred thoughts of peace, and here, the Carthaginians conceived their most cunning gambit. They would use Regulus as their puppet emissary. They would send him back to Rome under oath to argue for peace on Carthage's terms. The condition was simple and cruel. If he failed, he must return to Carthage, back into captivity. And Regulus, the Iron Roman, swore the oath. He would go home, speak his piece, and if Rome refused, he would walk back into the jaws of his enemies. It was a deal Carthage thought airtight. They believed they had chained his honor to their cause. But honor, as they would soon discover, is the most dangerous weapon in the Roman arsenal. Picture the scene. After years in a Carthaginian cage, Marcus Atilius Regulus was set loose, but not as a free man. No, he was released as a puppet, a mouthpiece for Carthage's desperation. They handed him an oath as tight as a noose. Travel back to Rome, plead for peace on their terms, and if it fails, return. Return to chains. Return to suffering. Return to whatever punishment his captors decided to cook up. In their arrogance, the Carthaginians thought they had outsmarted Rome itself. They forgot who they were dealing with. A Roman aristocrat, a man who believed honor was heavier than life, a man too stubborn to betray principle even if it cost him everything. The journey home must have been surreal for Regulus. After years of captivity, there he was again, breathing Roman air, sailing across waters he once commanded. As the ship approached the harbor, crowds gathered in disbelief. The man thought long dead was back, though bound by an oath that made him less resurrected hero and more walking ghost. His wife, Marcia, his children, the Senate, all rushed to him, joy strangled by dread. They knew his return was temporary. His very presence was a dagger hanging by a thread. Whispers spread through Rome like wildfire. Citizens debated what it meant. Had Carthage grown weak, desperate enough to use their greatest prisoner as a bargaining tool? Or was this a clever trap wrapped in diplomacy? The Senate prepared for his testimony with a kind of tense awe. They would not just hear a speech, they would hear a man speak from the threshold of his grave. When Regulus entered the Senate chamber, it was a theater of ghosts. These were his peers, men who had once toasted his victories, mourned his defeat, prayed for his return. They expected him to urge peace, to deliver Carthage's terms. But Regulus, never one for bending, spat their expectations back in their faces. He thundered not for peace but for war. He told them the Carthaginian offers were poison wrapped in honey, humiliating tributes, the loss of Sicily, Rome humbled into second-rate status. He painted Rome's defeat as a vision so vile the senators could practically taste ashes in their mouths. And here's the haunting brilliance. Every senator knew that by rejecting peace, Regulus was signing his own death warrant. He was arguing not just for Rome's future, but for his own destruction. It was suicide by principle, and he delivered it with the calm fury of a man already halfway to the grave. He reminded them Carthage was weakening. Their peace terms were not strength, but desperation. Rome still had the upper hand if it only endured. His voice carried the authority of experience and the weight of sacrifice. He had no reason to lie, no motive except truth. His speech was a dagger of conviction, and the Senate could not look away. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Some senators wept openly, struck by the cruelty of the choice laid before them. If they followed Regulus's advice, they doomed him. If they spared him, they risked Rome's honor and Rome's future. Some tried to twist the law, arguing that no oath made in chains should bind him. Others suggested keeping him in Rome, finding loopholes to keep their hero alive. But Regulus refused. His voice cut through the murk. His oath was sacred, his honor unbreakable, and to break it would shame Rome itself. His life was not worth Rome's word. It was this rigidity, this brutal devotion to principle, that made him both terrifying and tragic. He could not compromise, not even for himself, not even for his family. He demanded the Senate reject Carthage's terms, even if it meant delivering him back to his tormentors. He demanded that Rome choose honor over mercy, war over peace, his death over his life, and the Senate obeyed. With tears, with anguish, with reluctant admiration, they rejected Carthage's terms. Rome would continue the war, and Regulus, chains rattling invisibly around his wrists, prepared to keep his vow. Crowds gathered outside his home, begging him to stay, pleading with him to break his oath. They argued no god could bind a man by promises extracted under duress. They shouted that his duty to Rome was to live, not die. But Regulus ignored them all. He had made his choice, and in that choice lay Rome's immortal example of duty over self. Thus his final days in Rome became a living funeral. His wife wept, his children clung to him, the people prayed for divine intervention, but Regulus walked calmly, like a condemned man marching to his own pyre, knowing that his legend was being carved in real time. His departure from Rome was not triumphal, not even mournful. It was apocalyptic. Crowds lined the streets as if watching a ghost leave the city, for they knew he would never return. Rome had witnessed many victories, but this grim spectacle of a man walking willingly to torture and death, was perhaps its most haunting. So Regulus kept his oath, like a doomed actor walking back on stage for the final act. He sailed from Rome to Carthage, knowing full well he wasn't returning as an ambassador, but as meat for the slaughterhouse. The Carthaginians had gambled that he would deliver their peace terms and save their pride. Instead, he spat their words back into their faces, convincing Rome to fight on. Now, when he walked back into their city, he was no longer a prize, he was a problem, a humiliation, and humiliation demands blood. The Carthaginians didn't rage blindly. No, their revenge was cold, methodical, and theatrical. This wasn't about killing Regulus quickly. This was about turning his body into a sermon, a public theater of pain. His torment would not just break him. It would echo through Carthage's streets, seep into Rome's imagination, and terrify anyone foolish enough to defy Carthage again. The tortures began with sleep deprivation, a cruelty as invisible as it was merciless. They kept him awake for days, bombarding him with light, sound, constant interruptions. A general who once commanded armies, now reduced to a twitching wreck, denied even the mercy of unconsciousness. They angled mirrors to burn sunlight into his eyes, a blazing torment that drilled into his skull. Then, in one of those inventive touches only human sadism could invent, they cut away his eyelids. No rest, no darkness. Eternal daylight scalding his eyes until blindness crept in, like a thief, and still he did not break. So they escalated. They built him a spiked box, a coffin-shaped cage lined with metal points. Stand still, and the spikes kissed his flesh. Move, twitch, breathe wrong, and they pierced him. His very body betrayed him. Cramped, sweating, bleeding, he was forced to become his own tormentor. The claustrophobia, the stench of festering wounds, the constant punctures of jagged steel, all of it worked to strip him of dignity. But Regulus remained a Roman even in agony, a silent monument of defiance that mocked his captors' clever cruelty. The Carthaginians were frustrated. They had chipped at his body, peeled away his flesh, yet his spirit refused to collapse. So they planned a finale so grotesque it would become legend: execution by boiling oil. The decision wasn't random. Oil in ancient times carried symbolism: wealth, purification, sacrifice. What better way to make a statement than to take Rome's Iron General and turn him into a screaming human offering? They had a massive bronze cauldron constructed, large enough to contain a man, polished enough to reflect the horror on his face. They chose oil instead of water because oil clings. Oil burns slower, hotter, more viciously. Once inside, escape would be impossible. Flesh would melt and stick, and pain would become endless. And because cruelty must have an audience, they announced it citywide. Citizens, merchants, soldiers, even foreign diplomats, all flocked to see Regulus die. The execution was not just punishment, it was theater. They wanted Rome's allies to hear his screams in their nightmares. They wanted his death to be the headline of the Mediterranean. When the day came, Regulus was dragged out, a wrecked man, scarred, blinded, body trembling from endless torment. Yet witnesses swore he still carried himself with Roman dignity, even as ropes and pulleys suspended him above the cauldron like some grotesque sacrificial lamb. The air reeked of hot oil, smoke curling up like incense for a god of cruelty. The descent began slow. Inch by inch, the executioners lowered him, prolonging every scream, savoring the crowd's shuddering silence. When his feet first touched the oil, the sound of sizzling flesh snapped through the air like a curse. The scream that tore from his throat silenced even the most bloodthirsty onlookers. As his body was lowered deeper, inch by torturous inch, his agony became a symphony of horror echoing off Carthage's walls. The oil clung, seared, devoured him. His body convulsed, his voice broke into raw cries that carved themselves into memory. Ancient sources claim the torture was intended to last longer, but oil is a ruthless executioner. Shock and unconsciousness came quicker than his tormentors' plan. Yet by then, the damage was done. The crowd had seen enough to know they had witnessed cruelty distilled into its purest, ugliest form. When the cauldron stilled, the silence was heavier than any cheer of victory. Citizens left shaken. Some celebrated, yes, but many walked away disturbed, carrying with them the image of Rome's general boiled alive, an image that would ignite Roman vengeance like dry tinder. Regulus's death was not just an execution, it was a grotesque masterpiece of cruelty, a message carved into flesh and memory. And while the Carthaginians thought they had silenced him, they had in fact turned him into Rome's eternal ghost, a martyr whose screams would echo louder in Roman hearts than any horn of war. News of Regulus's boiling spread across the Mediterranean faster than a plague. Traders whispered it in ports, diplomats carried it in scrolls, soldiers muttered it by firelight. Rome heard every detail: the tortures, the spiked box, the oil, the screams. If Carthage had meant to terrify Rome into submission, they had miscalculated. They hadn't silenced a general. They had minted a martyr. Rome's reaction was not grief alone, but fury sharpened into vengeance. The Senate, which had agonized over the morality of honoring Regulus's oath, no longer faced any such dilemma. His death had stripped away doubt. Carthage had not simply killed a Roman consul, they had defiled him, and that desecration demanded repayment in blood. The first blade of vengeance came not from the Senate or legions, but from Marcia, Regulus's widow. History remembers her as the woman who refused to cry quietly. She took custody of Carthaginian prisoners held in Rome and repaid cruelty with cruelty. Spiked boxes, sleepless nights, torment designed to mirror the agony her husband endured, all inflicted on those unlucky enough to fall under her grasp. Her revenge was not just grief-stricken rage, but symbolic retaliation. Eye for eye, wound for wound. Rome applauded her savagery. In their eyes, she was the mirror of Regulus. Where he died in honor, she lived in vengeance. This cycle of cruelty, Rome and Carthage volleying horrors back and forth, became the defining rhythm of the Punic Wars. Regulus's fate had set the tone. The wars no longer felt like contests for land or trade. They became vendettas. Personal, bloody, escalating. Each atrocity justified the next, until cruelty itself became a weapon as familiar as the sword. But while Carthage believed it had staged a triumphant display of power, the truth is it had handed Rome a story too potent to ignore. Regulus's death became propaganda, a living sermon on Roman honor. Orders told and retold his choice: to keep his oath, to return to captivity, to walk willingly into death rather than break Rome's word. Poets immortalized his torment, turning every scream into a hymn of Roman courage. Children were raised on his story, taught that honor mattered more than life, and Rome believed it. His martyrdom gave the war a moral dimension that justified endless sacrifice. His death became the example senators cited when debating new levies, the name commanders whispered to steel their soldiers, the legend that reminded citizens that Rome did not compromise, even when compromise might save them. Regulus's corpse boiled in oil, but his legend burned hotter still. The Carthaginians had wanted to erase him, to turn him into a cautionary tale of defiance punished. Instead, they created a cult, the cult of Regulus. His ghost stalked Roman imagination, not as a broken man, but as proof that Rome's spirit was unbreakable. The Carthaginian executioners had destroyed flesh, but carved immortality. Of course, cruelty breeds cruelty. Marcia's torments of Carthaginian prisoners lit a spiral of violence that only deepened the savagery of the wars. Carthaginian prisoners screamed in Roman cages, just as Romans had screamed in Carthaginian ones. The seas between Sicily and Africa became graveyards. Cities were stripped, civilians enslaved, soldiers slaughtered without mercy. Regulus's story had shown both sides the power of suffering, and each wielded it like a weapon. Yet for Rome, the story hardened into something more than vengeance. Regulus became the gold standard of Roman duty. He had chosen death over dishonor, and that choice became the moral backbone of the Republic's identity. His name was invoked for centuries as proof that Rome's word was eternal. In politics, in war, in philosophy, Regulus was the shining, bleeding example of integrity carried to its cruelest extreme. The irony is thick. Carthage boiled him to break Rome's will, but instead they gave Rome an unbreakable symbol. His death, meant to weaken, became the iron nail fastening Roman determination. The oil consumed his body, but the story spread like wildfire, immortalizing him more effectively than any statue or triumph ever could. In the end, Rome didn't just remember Regulus. Rome weaponized him. He was no longer just a general. He was a martyr, a ghost, a rallying cry. Carthage had killed the man, but they had handed Rome the myth. And myths, as Carthage would learn, are more dangerous than armies. Regulus's death was not the end of his story. If anything, it was the beginning. His flesh had been boiled away in oil, but the legend that rose from that cauldron proved indestructible. Carthage thought it had staged a display of terror so absolute that Rome would cower. Instead, it handed Rome a martyr to worship, a ghost to carry into every battle, and a story to tell for generations. His screams meant to silence became eternal thunder. Roman orators seized on his tail like starving wolves. His choice to keep his oath, his march back into captivity, his unbroken dignity through torture, all became moral sermons delivered in the Forum. "Look," they cried, "this is Rome. This is honor. This is the blood price we are willing to pay." His story became political ammunition used to justify fresh campaigns, heavier taxes, and more sacrifices. It was no longer just about Sicily or Carthage. It was about Rome's soul, sharpened against the whetstone of Regulus's agony. Historians and poets polished his martyrdom into gleaming legend. Horace would later invoke him as the ultimate symbol of integrity. Others painted him as the man who, by dying horribly, purified Rome's virtue. His ghost walked in literature, philosophy, even politics. Senators evoked his name when arguing for war. Generals told his story around campfires to stiffen spines. His choice to die rather than dishonor himself became the measure of Roman manhood. And it worked. Regulus's martyrdom helped carry Rome through the long, grinding years of the First Punic War. His insistence that Carthage was weak proved prophetic. Rome endured, and in the end, Rome won. His advice from the Senate floor, to reject peace and fight on, was vindicated in blood and victory. He had been right, and that grim correctness gave his legend even sharper teeth. The irony is almost unbearable. Carthage, in torturing him, had proven its cruelty. But cruelty has a shelf life. Instead of inspiring fear, it inspired resolve. Instead of breaking Rome's will, it hardened it. Carthage gave Rome exactly what Rome needed: a saint of suffering. Regulus had been boiled to annihilation, but Carthage had brewed its own destruction in the same pot. Yet the story's horror never faded. His tortures, the sleepless nights, the sunlight in his mutilated eyes, the spiked box, the cauldron, lingered in Roman imagination as a grotesque reminder of what their enemies were capable of. Rome never forgot. They carried that cruelty with them into the next wars, using it to justify their own atrocities. Carthage's punishment of Regulus gave Rome not just a martyr, but permission. Permission to be just as brutal, just as inventive in their cruelty. It opened a door that could never be closed, and so the cycle of horror spiraled on. Regulus's widow Marcia's vengeance had already mirrored his tormentors' methods, but the Roman war machine institutionalized the cruelty. Prisoners suffered because Regulus had suffered. Cities burned because his screams still echoed. Rome answered boiling oil with firestorms of its own making, setting the standard for a Punic War that would eventually end, not with a treaty, but with Carthage's annihilation. Still, beneath all the blood and vengeance, Regulus remained something darker, a symbol of principle taken to its extreme. His choice, to die for honor rather than live for compromise, has fascinated thinkers for millennia. Some call it heroic, others foolish. Was it noble to march willingly into torture, or was it blind arrogance dressed as integrity? Philosophers wrestled with his ghost long after his body was ash. Leaders invoked him when urging sacrifice. His name became shorthand for the eternal tension between survival and principle. Even in modern times, his story rattles like chains in the dark. Military academies dissect his choices. Ethicists debate whether honor should ever demand self-destruction. His tortures, eerily familiar in their psychological precision, remind us that cruelty is timeless, that humanity has always been clever at inventing pain. In Regulus's death, we glimpse not just antiquity's barbarism, but our own. That's the true terror of Marcus Atilius Regulus. Not the oil, not the spikes, not even the silence after his final scream. It's the realization that his story is eternal, that humans will always torture, always justify cruelty, always turn suffering into theater and legend. Carthage wanted to destroy him, but instead they carved a monument out of his agony. The legacy of Regulus is a paradox, both inspiration and warning. To Rome, he was the purest Roman, the man who proved honor outlives flesh. To the rest of us, he is a mirror showing the brutal price of uncompromising virtue. His captors destroyed his body, but in doing so, they made him immortal. Even now, 2,000 years later, his ghost smolders in history like a coal that refuses to die out. A coal that whispers, honor can consume you, cruelty never ends, and sometimes the loudest victory comes from a scream boiling out of a cauldron. The story of Marcus Atilius Regulus did not fade with the smoke of his execution. It lived on, coiled like a serpent in Rome's imagination, biting again and again with its venom of horror and honor. Carthage may have boiled him alive, but Rome turned his agony into eternal fire. His death was not just history, it was myth-making in real time, a grotesque gospel of Roman values preached from the pulpit of suffering. Ancient writers could not resist him. Polybius, Livy, and later poets like Horace dragged his bloodied ghost back onto the page to remind generations that honor was heavier than flesh. His torment was retold with all the drama of a tragedy and all the precision of a military manual. His choices became lessons. This is what Rome demands of her sons. This is the price of duty. This is the cost of glory. Children learned his tale as if it were scripture. Senators recited his name like a vow. Generals carried his legend into battle like a shield. And still, questions gnawed. Was he wise or was he mad? Some argued his sacrifice was pointless, that a man who abandons his family for an oath is more fanatic than hero. Others declared him the highest example of Roman virtue, a man who turned death itself into proof of Rome's superiority. The debate has never died. In that tension lies the haunting power of his story. Regulus was not simply a martyr. He was a riddle, a paradox carved into Roman identity. Even beyond Rome, his story spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. Allies admired it. Enemies feared it. The message was clear. Romans keep their oaths, even if it means marching into a cauldron of oil. This reputation became Rome's most dangerous weapon. Armies may falter, fleets may sink, but the world believed in Rome's unbreakable resolve because one general chose torment over dishonor. Regulus became not just a man, but a policy, a ghost wielded in diplomacy as much as on the battlefield. His execution also revealed something far darker, the sheer sophistication of human cruelty. The Carthaginians had not killed him in rage, but with chilling calculation. Sleep deprivation, sensory torture, mutilation, the spiked coffin, the boiling cauldron. Each was chosen, staged, and executed with theatrical precision. It wasn't barbarism in the heat of passion, it was barbarism as policy, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of Regulus's death. Cruelty isn't an accident of history, it's a tool, it's timeless, it's us. Rome took that lesson to heart. The Punic Wars became a cycle of escalating atrocities, cruelty feeding cruelty, until both empires were drunk on vengeance. Regulus's widow Marcia tortured Carthaginian prisoners with mirrored punishments. Roman soldiers butchered civilians in the name of honor, and yet amid all this, Regulus remained the moral lodestone, the proof that Rome's word could outlast its flesh. His torment did not deter them, it licensed them. His screams gave Rome permission to unleash horrors of its own. But Regulus was more than a weapon for propaganda or revenge. He became a symbol that transcended war. Philosophers invoked him when debating virtue. Statesmen used him as shorthand for incorruptible integrity. His legends seeped into centuries of thought, resurfacing whenever humanity needed an example of principled madness. The kind of decision that terrifies precisely because it is unshakable. And that is why his story still lingers. It is not just about a Roman boiled alive. It is about the eternal struggle between pragmatism and principle, between life and honor, between flesh and the ideals we pretend are worth dying for. Regulus embodies the terrifying answer. Sometimes ideals consume the man who holds them. Sometimes honor devours its own. Carthage thought it ended him. Instead, they made him immortal. His name is etched not just into marble or scrolls, but into the marrow of history itself. His screams still echo, not because oil burned him, but because Rome decided to turn those screams into scripture. His death became a mirror for every age, reflecting both the heights of moral courage and the depths of human cruelty. More than 2,000 years later, the shadow of Marcus Atilius Regulus still flickers like firelight across the walls of our imagination. His story is inspiration and warning, halo and noose. He is proof that legends are often forged not in victory, but in agony, not in triumph, but in the terrible silence after the scream. Regulus did not live to see Rome's final victory over Carthage. He did not hear the cheers when his people triumphed, but he did not need to. His death had already secured him something more enduring than empire. He had become a ghost that even time could not kill. And ghosts, as Carthage learned too late, are far harder to conquer than men.